Imagine waking up one morning to find that your country has been reborn, or so you are told. The flag outside your window is different now. The salute your children give their teachers is different. The books on their shelves have been rewritten. The neighbors who used to live 3 doors down are simply gone, and no one asks where they went. This is not a story about soldiers on the front lines. This is not a story about tanks rolling through France or bombers tearing apart London's skyline. This is a far more intimate story, and in many ways, a far more disturbing one. This is the story of ordinary life inside the most ideologically engineered society in modern history. This is the story of Germany between 1939 and 1945. Of the baker who sold bread to SS officers, of the mother who taught her son to say Heil Hitler before she taught him to pray, of the professor who burned the books he once loved, of the child who genuinely believed. Welcome to the world that the Third Reich built from the inside out. To understand what life was like inside Nazi Germany during World War II, you must first understand the world that existed just before it, because the war did not fall upon Germany like a sudden storm. It was invited in, slowly, deliberately, over years of mounting fever. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler had already been in power for several years. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, had dismantled democratic institutions, eliminated political rivals, and constructed a state apparatus built on surveillance, propaganda, and ideological conformity. When the war officially began on the 1st of September 1939, with the invasion of Poland, the German population did not erupt in ecstatic celebration the way propaganda films would later suggest. Many Germans were anxious. They remembered the last war, the trenches, the hunger, the humiliation of defeat, the collapse of the economy. They had lived through the Weimar Republic's chaos. They had buried fathers and uncles from the First World War, but they also believed. Many of them genuinely believed. Hitler's regime had spent 6 years carefully reweaving the social fabric of Germany. It had replaced despair with purpose, economic ruin with apparent prosperity, national shame with ferocious pride. The autobahns were being built. Unemployment had plummeted through rearmament, through massive public works, through a war economy quietly assembled beneath the surface of civilian life. To the average German in 1939, the regime had delivered what it promised, and that made what was coming extraordinarily easy to accept. Step into a German city in 1940. Walk its streets. The storefronts are largely stocked. The trams are running. Children in Hitler Youth uniforms cycle past in tight formations, their faces bright with belonging. Women push prams along tree-lined avenues. The smell of fresh bread drifts from a bakery where a hand-lettered sign in the window reads, Deutsche Ware Kaufen, buy German goods. On the surface, life in Germany during the early war years had a disturbing normalcy to it. Theaters were open, films were showing. The Berlin Philharmonic was performing. Restaurants served meals. Department stores sold goods. People fell in love, got married, had children. They complained about the weather and the price of butter. They gossiped about neighbors and worried about their jobs. But underneath that surface, the infrastructure of terror ran like a hidden river. The Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, or secret state police was not the vast omnipresent army of myth. In a city like Dusseldorf, with nearly 500,000 people, there might be fewer than 50 Gestapo officers, and yet fear of them was total. How? Because the regime had turned the population into its own surveillance network. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Colleagues reported colleagues. Children, indoctrinated through the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, sometimes reported their own parents for making an offhand remark against the Führer. The historian Robert Gellatly, in his exhaustive research on this period, found that the majority of Gestapo investigations were not initiated by Gestapo agents at all. They were initiated by ordinary German citizens, filing voluntary denunciations. This is perhaps the most unsettling truth about life inside the Third Reich. The terror did not only come from above, it rose, in significant part, from within. The question that has haunted historians for generations is this: what did ordinary Germans know about the regime's crimes? The short answer is, far more than many later claimed. The persecution of Jewish Germans had been visible, legal, and public since 1933. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had stripped Jewish citizens of their rights in plain daylight. The violence of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9 and 10, 1938, was not a secret operation carried out in darkness. Synagogues burned in city centers. Shop windows shattered across main streets. Jewish men were dragged from their homes in front of crowds. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps in the immediate aftermath. Hundreds were killed. People saw. People walked past the broken glass the next morning. Some were horrified. Some were indifferent. Some quietly helped their Jewish neighbors. And some participated. When deportations began in earnest after 1941, they too were not entirely hidden. Trains moved through stations. Neighbors watched as families were taken from apartment buildings with suitcases. Some Germans received letters from soldiers stationed in the East Letters that described, sometimes in chilling detail, mass executions of Jewish civilians. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units had shot over 1 million people in open fields and ravines across the Soviet Union by the end of 1941. The soldiers who carried out these massacres went home on leave. They sat at dinner tables, they talked to wives, brothers, friends. Knowledge seeped into the fabric of German society like ink into water, impossible to fully contain, impossible to trace. The regime knew this, and its propaganda ministry worked constantly to reframe, redirect, and normalize what was happening. Jews were not being murdered. They were being resettled. They were being evacuated to the east. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, and deliberately opaque. And for many, the language was enough. It provided the cover of plausible deniability, a thin, comfortable lie that made ordinary life possible. War transformed the material reality of daily life in Germany with gathering speed. In the early years of the conflict, 1939 and 1940, the German economy was largely protected from the full weight of wartime sacrifice. Hitler was acutely aware that the civilian population's privation had been a major factor in the collapse of German morale during the First World War. He was determined not to repeat that mistake. Food rations, while restricted, were initially generous by the standards of occupied Europe. Germany extracted enormous resources from the nations it conquered: food, labor, raw materials. France fed Germany. Poland fed Germany. The occupied Soviet territories were stripped to their bones. But as the war ground on, as the Soviet campaign became a catastrophic quagmire, as the Allied bombing campaign intensified, as supply chains fractured and the economy bled, daily life in Germany grew harder by degrees. Ration cards governed everything. Each citizen carried a book of coupons that determined how much meat, fat, bread, and sugar they could purchase each week. The allocations shrank as the war progressed. By 1943, the average German civilian was eating significantly less than they had at the war's outset. The black market flourished in the shadows, with cigarettes serving as the unofficial currency of desperate transactions. Farmers who could grow their own food were quietly envied. Urban families who had contacts in the countryside sent parcels and received them. In return, a quiet, unofficial economy of survival running parallel to the official one. Clothing, too, was rationed. Leather was reserved for military boots. Wool was requisitioned. Women repaired and re-repaired their stockings until they were more patch than stocking. Children's clothes were handed down, altered, handed down again. The culture of Eintopf, the one-pot Sunday meal, promoted by the regime as an act of patriotic solidarity, became a genuine culinary reality rather than a propaganda exercise. Families gathered around a single pot of soup and called it enough. The Nazi regime held a deeply contradictory relationship with German women. On one hand, the ideology of National Socialism was explicitly patriarchal. Women were celebrated as mothers, as the biological foundation of the Aryan race, as the keepers of hearth and home, the Kinder, Küche, Kirche, ideal children, kitchen, church, was the official vision of German womanhood. The regime rewarded women who bore multiple children with the Mother's Cross, bronze for 4, silver for 6, gold for 8 or more. Women were discouraged from pursuing higher education or professional careers. Their role was to produce the next generation of German soldiers, and yet war has a way of dismantling ideology with brutal efficiency. As millions of German men were consumed by the military, the labor force they left behind created a vacuum that could not be filled by ideology alone. Women flooded into factories, post offices, transportation networks, and administrative roles. They drove trams, operated machinery, processed military logistics, and managed farms. By the mid-war years, the gap between the official image of German womanhood and its lived reality had grown into a chasm. The women of Germany also bore the weight of an especially intimate kind of terror-the-waiting. Letters that took weeks to arrive, telegrams that arrived instead, the knock on the door that no one wanted to answer. Millions of German women spent the war years in a state of suspended grief, managing households, raising children, sustaining communities, while the men they loved were consumed by a war fought in their name. Perhaps no aspect of life inside Nazi Germany is more haunting than what was done to its children. From the earliest years, the regime understood that the next generation was its most important project. Schools were transformed. Curricula were rewritten. Biology classes taught racial theory as scientific fact. History was reshaped to place the Germanic peoples at the center of human civilization. Mathematics problems used calculations involving the cost of maintaining disabled citizens, framing human beings as economic burdens. Physical fitness was elevated above intellectual achievement. Obedience was the supreme virtue. The Hitler Youth, the Hitler Jugend, enrolled boys from the age of 10, and by 1939, membership was effectively compulsory. Millions of German boys spent their adolescence in an organization that combined camping trips and athletic competitions with military drilling, ideological indoctrination, and the cultivation of absolute loyalty to the Führer. The Parallel Organization for Girls, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, prepared young women for their biological and domestic destiny, while simultaneously offering them a degree of physical freedom and group identity that many found genuinely exhilarating. These were not children born into cynicism. They were children who believed with the complete, uncritical faith that only the young can fully summon. Many of them had never known a Germany that was not National Socialist. Hitler was not a political figure. To them, he was closer to a father, a prophet, a national deity. When the reality of the regime's crimes eventually became undeniable, the psychological devastation for many survivors of that generation was profound and lasting, beginning in 1942 and escalating dramatically through 1943 and 1944. The Allied strategic bombing campaign began to reach into the heart of German civilian life in ways that no propaganda could fully conceal or explain away. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in single nights. Hamburg, July 1943. Operation Gomorrah. For 8 consecutive nights, British and American aircraft dropped incendiary and high-explosive bombs on Germany's second-largest city. The resulting firestorm, a phenomenon so intense that it created its own weather system, drawing oxygen into its center with tornado-force winds, killed an estimated 37,000 people and left over 1 million homeless. Survivors described streets flowing with burning asphalt, people reduced to ash in air raid shelters, the smell of the city that did not leave their memories for the rest of their lives. Dresden, February 1945. A city that had been largely spared the worst of the bombing, that had become a refuge for hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. Over 2 nights, Allied bombers reduced its medieval center to a landscape of ruin and death. The precise death toll remains disputed. Among historians, estimates range from 22,000 to over 25,000. But the physical and psychological impact on German civilian morale was immense. Germans developed an intimate daily relationship with destruction. Air raid sirens became the soundtrack of nighttime. Families slept in shifts so that someone would always be awake to hear the warning. Children learned to identify the sound of different aircraft engines. Bomb shelters were fitted out with small comforts, a favorite book, a family photograph, a stuffed animal, as if the rituals of normalcy could hold the world together. And in a way, they did. Because what is perhaps most remarkable about the German civilian population under this assault is not how it broke, but how long it held. It would be a profound historical distortion to suggest that all Germans complied. Resistance to the Nazi regime existed, but it existed in a landscape of almost unimaginable risk, where a single careless word could mean arrest, torture, and death. It took forms both dramatic and quietly human. The White Rose was a small student resistance group based in Munich, centered around siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, and a circle of friends who had grown up inside the Hitler Youth and emerged from it with their consciences intact. Beginning in 1942, they distributed leaflets throughout German universities, calling on their fellow citizens to resist the regime. Their words were extraordinary in their clarity and courage. "We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." In February 1943, Hans and Sophie were arrested after being observed distributing leaflets at the University of Munich. They were tried before the People's Court, convicted of treason, and guillotined within days of their arrest. Sophie Scholl was 21 years old. The July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. Operation Valkyrie was orchestrated by a network of military officers and civilian conspirators who had concluded that the war was lost and that the only way to save Germany from total destruction was to kill its leader. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb in Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler survived, with injuries. In the brutal reprisals that followed, nearly 5,000 people were executed, including many of Germany's most distinguished military figures. Ordinary resistance took quieter forms, hiding Jewish neighbors in attics and cellars, passing food to forced laborers, refusing to denounce a colleague, making a joke about Hitler in a trusted company. These acts were small, fragile, and dangerous, and they were more common than the mythology of total compliance suggests. There is one dimension of life inside wartime Germany that is often overlooked in popular histories: the millions of non-German people who lived and labored within Germany's borders under conditions of coercion, brutality, and death. By 1944, approximately 8 million forced laborers recruited by force, deception, or outright kidnapping from occupied territories across Europe were working in German factories, farms, mines, and households. They were French prisoners of war, Soviet civilians, Polish workers, Jewish concentration camp inmates leased to industrial corporations, Italian soldiers who refused to continue fighting after Italy's armistice. They slept in barracks and camps scattered throughout cities and countryside. They wore identifying badges that marked them as inferior, subject to different rules, liable to be shot for infractions that a German worker might receive a warning for. German civilians saw them every day. They worked alongside them in factories. They passed them in the street. Some treated them with quiet, dangerous humanity, sharing food, offering a kind word, looking the other way. Many more regarded them with indifference or contempt, conditioned by years of propaganda that had classified Slavic and Jewish peoples as subhuman. These millions of invisible presences, the Fremdarbeiter, the foreign workers, represent one of the most direct and intimate points of contact between ordinary German life and the regime's crimes. Their suffering was not happening somewhere distant and unknown. It was happening in the next factory hall. It was happening on the farm down the road. It was visible, if one chose to see it. By the autumn of 1944, the reality that the regime's propaganda had strained for years to conceal was becoming impossible to deny. The Soviet forces were advancing from the east with overwhelming force, and with them came terror. A terror fed by years of Nazi propaganda depicting Soviet soldiers as savage beasts, and compounded by the knowledge, which many Germans carried like a stone, of what German forces had done in the Soviet Union: the massacres, the starvation, the systematic murder of millions. If there was to be retribution, many Germans feared it would be total. The regime responded to imminent defeat not by seeking peace, but by escalating the demand for sacrifice. The Volkssturm, the people's militia, conscripted boys as young as 15 and men as old as 60 into service, armed with weapons so inadequate that many units carried one rifle between 3 men. Goebbels' propaganda shifted its tone from triumphalism to apocalyptic defiance. Germany would fight to the last. The Führer would deliver a miracle. The wonder weapons were coming. Victory was still possible. Many Germans no longer believed this, but many continued to act as if they did, because the alternative, in a state where defeatism could be punished by execution, was simply too dangerous to contemplate. In the cities, daily life in early 1945 had taken on the quality of a nightmare that could not be awakened from. The infrastructure was collapsing. Running water and electricity were intermittent. The postal system had broken down. Markets stood empty. Refugees from the eastern territories flooded westward in vast, desperate columns. Civilian masses fleeing in the depths of winter, abandoning everything, sleeping in ditches and barns, dying on the roads. The images that German civilians in western cities saw of these refugees told them everything the official radio broadcasts refused to say. On the 30th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his underground bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet forces fought their way through the streets above. On May 8, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The silence that followed was not relief. It was not celebration. It was something more complicated and more terrible. A silence filled with the weight of what had been done and the impossible task of understanding how it had happened. In the weeks and months after the war's end, German civilians confronted, many for the first time in full clarity, the nature of the regime they had inhabited, enabled, and in ways large and small served. Allied forces liberated the concentration camps and published the images. The photographs and newsreel footage of Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the mountains of shoes and hair and personal belongings reached into German living rooms and demanded an answer that no collective silence could permanently suppress. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, established the legal and moral framework for what the regime had done, naming its crimes against humanity with precision and consequence. But the reckoning did not end in Nuremberg. It has not ended yet. Generations of historians, philosophers, survivors, and ordinary Germans have wrestled with the questions that the Third Reich left behind. How does an advanced, educated, culturally sophisticated society construct a machinery of genocide? How do ordinary people, bakers, teachers, mothers, doctors, engineers come to participate in, enable, or simply accept the mass murder of their neighbors? What combination of fear, ideology, self-interest, indifference, and genuine belief makes such a thing possible? These questions do not have simple answers. That is precisely why they matter, because the story of life inside Nazi Germany is not only a story about Germany, it is a story about human nature, about the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to adapt to extraordinary circumstances, to normalize the abnormal, to find ways of living alongside horror without being destroyed by the sight of it. It is a story about what happens when the institutions that protect human dignity are dismantled one by one, when the language that describes reality is systematically corrupted, when the community that might resist is fragmented and made to fear itself. It is, in the end, a story that remains urgently, uncomfortably relevant, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a warning written in the most expensive ink history has ever known. The blood of millions of human beings who deserve to live